Dr. Doom arrived in Warhammer 40K universe. The corridor had no name. It had not been walked in 4,000 years. The wraithbone walls breathed with the residue of grief so old it had crystallized into something harder than sorrow, something closer to stone, and the bioluminescent tracery that pulsed through the bone-pale surfaces cast everything in the color of a dying ember, amber bleeding into deep violet, light that illuminated without warming. The air was thick, not with dust, with memory. Every surface in the webway remembers what passed through it, and this corridor remembered a fleet departing for Iandan's defense, remembered the silence after, remembered the ships that did not return. Into this silence stepped Victor von Doom. He came through a collapse, not a gate. The apparatus behind him, 3 months of reconstructed sorcerous geometry built from first principles inside a dying fold of interdimensional space, came apart at its seams in a cascade of emerald fire and shredding mathematics, and the last of it closed like a wound sealing over before he had fully cleared the threshold. His armor was scorched across the left pauldron and down the length of the gauntlet on his right hand. The metal darkened to the color of old blood. The green of his cloak was singed at the hem. His mask looked back at the collapsed gate with the expression it always wore, impassive, imperial, certain, and his eyes behind the iron regarded the slowly dying light of his failed apparatus with the particular cold fury of a man who has accepted that he has made an error and is already calculating what the error cost him. The answer, measured against what he had attempted, was considerable. He had moved to rewrite the architecture of dimensional transition at a cosmic scale. The attempt had failed. Not catastrophically, not in the way of screaming voids and burning cognition, but with the clean, precise failure of a mechanism built to tolerances beyond current material. The apparatus had consumed 11 months of preparation, components drawn from 5 separate realities, and the full measure of his sorcerous reserves, which even now were not empty, but were, for Victor von Doom, uncomfortably low. He was not stranded, he was not powerless, he was inconvenienced, which in Doom's personal cosmology was a category barely distinct from insult. He turned from the collapsed gate and faced the corridor. Doom had walked through many kinds of dark, the dark of Mephisto's realms, which was warm and rotten and wanted things from you, the dark of deep space, which was indifferent in the way of cold mathematics, the dark of Latveria's oldest forests, which was his, which he owned, and which knew it. This dark was none of those. This dark had weight in a direction he had no name for, a pressure from a dimension that ran perpendicular to his own experience of reality, and it was layered, stacked, geological in its accumulation. He felt psychic resonance the way a man standing in a bell tower feels the vibration of the bell after it has stopped ringing, not sound, aftermath, 10,000 years of it. He reached into the structure of the space around him with his sorcerous perception and catalogued what he found. The energy matrix was unlike anything in his experience, not unlike it in the way that implied deficiency, but unlike it in the way that implied profound antiquity. This was not chaos sorcery, not the churning random fecundity of the warp he had already begun sensing at the outer edges of this dimension like a distant drumline. This was structured. This was engineered. The psychic current running through the wraithbone walls followed geometries of purpose, the same geometries of purpose he used when he built his own sorcerous infrastructure, and the similarity was enough to tell him that whatever made this place also understood that power without architecture was merely noise. Interesting. He had been in the webway for approximately 40 seconds before he heard the laughter. It came from above, or from what was conventionally above, given that in a wraithbone corridor where the surfaces flowed into one another without seams, directionality was something of a polite fiction. It was high and silver and completely unself-conscious, the laughter of someone encountering something they had not expected and finding genuine delight in the gap between prediction and reality. It had been, though Doom did not know this yet, 107 years since Quillaveth Morn had laughed like that. She descended, if descended was the correct word, from a junction in the corridor wall that was not a junction in any way visible to the eye until she came through it. and she came through it, moving in the particular manner of the harlequins, which is to say, in a way that made it aesthetically impossible to determine whether she was walking, or dancing, or simply choosing to exist in various places in sequence, while the spaces between were editorial decisions. Her mask was the color of fractured ice, white threaded with lines of deep blue and silver, and the fractured mirror that served as its centerpiece caught the amber light of the corridor and threw it back in 7 directions simultaneously, none of which were the source. She was small in the way that things which have survived longer than everything around them are small, compressed, dense with implication. She looked at Doom. Her masked face tracked down the scorched pauldron, down the darkened gauntlet, across the ruined hem of the cloak, up to the iron mask. She laughed again. "A conqueror," she said, and her Gothic was flawless in the way that ancient things are flawless, not learned, but absorbed. "Who has misplaced his kingdom?" "A jester," Doom replied, "who mistakes theater for cleverness." Her head tilted. Behind the fractured mirror, something moved. The eyes, perhaps, or the quality of attention, some recalibration of regard. "You are not afraid," she observed. "I am never afraid. Everyone says that," she said, and there was no mockery in it, or rather, there was mockery in it, in the way that starlight contains heat, technically present, functionally distant. Most of them are wrong. You might be the first who means it. She reached into a fold of her costume that should not have had the geometry to contain anything, and withdrew a hand mirror no larger than her palm. Its surface was not reflective in the conventional sense. It showed things, but not the things in front of it. She held it up at the angle of a woman consulting a text. Her attention moved between the mirror and the iron mask with the quality of someone cross-referencing sources. What she saw in the mirror, she would not share for some time. What she felt, standing in that amber-lit corridor with the weight of crystallized grief pressing in from every surface, was something that required the particular harlequin vocabulary of the soul. Here was a mortal man who had armored himself so completely, from the inside out, that the armor had become the man, and what was underneath the armor was not a wound, or not only a wound, but a foundation. Not absence where the self had been, architecture, something built with intention and maintained with ferocity, so that if you removed the armor you would not find a softer Victor von Doom, you would find the load-bearing walls. She lowered the mirror. "You are far from everything you know," she said. "Everything I know travels with me." She considered this, then she said, with a precision that suggested she was measuring the weight of each word before committing it to air. "Then perhaps you will consent to know something new. There is a council, there are spirit seers who will want to examine what the webway has collected. And there is a craft world above us that has more dead than living, and that has been grieving since before your species learned to write." Doom surveyed the corridor. He surveyed the collapsed gate, and the mathematics of its failure, which he had already begun the preliminary stages of reassembling in the back of his mind. He surveyed the shadow seer with the comprehensive attention he gave to everything, the attention that missed nothing and forgave nothing, and was incapable of pretending that something was other than what it was. "You are managing this," he said. "Not a question." She said nothing, but her hands made a small gesture, a magician's gesture, the gesture of someone spreading cards across a table to show that they are all present and all legitimate, and the gesture said, "I am always managing something. This is merely what I do." "Lead," said Doom. She turned and moved back toward the junction that was not a junction, and he followed, because the information she possessed exceeded the information he possessed, and Doom was contemptuous of many things but never of data. The walk through the dead corridors of Ianden's webway access took something close to an hour. Doom spent it in the way he spent most time not actively engaged in combat or crisis, cataloging. The Wraithbone construction was remarkable. Not in the way that Richard's devices were remarkable, with the maddening borrowed future cleverness that never sat right in Doom's hands, but in the way of genuine synthesis, sorcery, and material science, interwoven so thoroughly that the distinction between them had dissolved. The walls were not made of sorcerously imbued material. They were sorcery that had taken material form. The difference mattered enormously to a man who had spent his life standing at the intersection of those two disciplines. He asked questions. Not many, and not showing more interest than the situation warranted, but specific questions, precise questions, the questions of a man who is building a model in his mind and identifying the gaps. Quillaveth answered some of them. Others she deflected with information she clearly found more interesting than what he had asked. She told him that the bioluminescent patterns in the walls were not decorative, that they were the ongoing psychic residue of the craft world's dead, that what he was reading as architecture was also, in a very real sense, a continuous eulogy written in light. Doom walked through the eulogy and said nothing for a while after that. The council chamber, when they reached it, occupied a space in the craft world itself, rather than the webway proper. Accessed through a transition he felt as a thinning of the barrier between places, like pressing through a membrane of glass-cold water. The room was large enough to hold a significant gathering, but the gathering was not significant. 3 spirit seers, 2 wraith guards standing at parade rest in the corners, their ghost helms blank and radiant, the spirits inside them distant and certain as fixed stars. Tapestries on the walls showing battles he did not know against enemies he would catalogue later. And at the center of it, light falling from no obvious source. The particular quality of grief in the air that he had felt throughout the approach but concentrated here, made deliberate. The eldest spirit seer was a woman, if that word applied with any precision to a being of her evident age, robed in deep blue with bone-pale ornamentation that echoed the wraithbone of the walls. Her name was Thessivale, and she had been reading the dead for longer than the Imperium had been a nightmare. She looked at Doom the way Doom looked at things he had not yet categorized, with the attention that preceded classification, and her expression contained something he was not accustomed to seeing directed at himself. Uncertainty. "The webway does not collect," she said. Her Gothic was slower than Quillaveth's, more careful, the Gothic of someone for whom it remained genuinely foreign, and yet here stands something the webway has gathered. "The webway has gathered a lord," said Doom, "who requires transit back to his own dimension and finds himself momentarily without the mechanism to achieve it." "A lord," she repeated. "Of what?" "Of Latveria, of all things in it, of considerably more before long." The second spirit seer, younger, darker robed, spoke in Eldari to the first, and Quillaveth translated without being asked. "He says you have the soul structure of a infinity circuit anchor. He wants to know if you feel pressure when you stand near the dead." Doom turned that over. "Define pressure." "The weight," said Thessivale, choosing the word carefully, "of someone standing close to you who you cannot see." The silence between them measured something. Then Doom said, "Yes." The spirit seers exchanged a look that contained more information than most conversations. Thessivale rose from her position and approached him directly, which was an action that apparently surprised the other two, because their posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward readiness. She stopped 3 paces away and studied the iron mask. "Your sorcery is old," she said. "My sorcery is mine. Old is not a criticism. Old is recognition." She turned aside and moved to a side alcove where a wraithbone frame held a structure he took a moment to identify as a seer's working, the Eldari equivalent of a diagnostic array, and she spoke to it in a low, continuous murmur while her hands moved over its surface in the manner of a physician conducting an examination. "Our dead do not end," she said, not looking at him. "They continue, in the crystal, in the circuit, in the warrior forms. They serve, they know, they remember. This is what the craft worlds are, not just ships, not just refuge, the preservation of all who have ever belonged to us." "I know what you are describing," said Doom, something in his voice. Not warmth, not the approach of warmth, but a tone, a very specific tone that lived in the space between comprehension and feeling, that made Thessivale stop her work and look at him. "You know the shape of it," she said slowly. "I know the motivation." He stood very still in the center of the room, and the wraith guard in the corners were perfectly motionless, and even the light seemed to be waiting. I have spent 30 years working toward the liberation of a soul from a domain not unlike the one you call the warp, a soul that should not be where it is, a soul that deserves more than what was done to it. His voice did not change. It was the same iron register it had been since the corridor. But it was saying something the iron register had not said to anyone who was not himself, in a very long time. The impulse to refuse the death of those we love, to refuse the terms offered, to build systems that preserve what should not have to be lost. I understand this impulse precisely. Thesivale was very still. You have made yourself into a fortress, she said quietly. Yes, because the alternative was grief. The word landed in the room and did not dissipate. It hung in the light that fell from no source and moved nowhere, and the Wraith Guard at the corners registered nothing because they registered nothing anymore, and Quillaveth Morn stood at the edge of the room and said nothing, which was the most deliberate act of the entire exchange. The grief is still there, said Thesivale, not gently, but with the precision of a surgeon naming the location of a wound. Beneath the fortress. The grief, said Doom, is not your concern. No, she agreed, but the fortress is interesting. The fortress is the most interesting thing we have seen walk into the webway in a very long time. The youngest spirit seer spoke again. Quillaveth translated. She asks if you believe your mother is in pain. The room temperature did not change, but something in the quality of the air shifted, the way air shifts in the second before lightning, some ionic recalibration that precedes discharge. Yes, said Doom. Then we have more in common, said Thesivale, than either of us would prefer. For 3 weeks, Doom worked. He was given access to a section of the craft world that the Spirit Seers designated a working space, which meant a room with wraithbone walls and no furniture, and a quality of silence that actively supported concentration, the kind of silence that felt purposive rather than simply absent of sound. He spent the first 3 days completing his catalogue of the dimensional shift that had deposited him in the webway, mapping the collapse backwards to understand precisely what had gone wrong, a process he described to no one, and which required a particular brand of cold self-examination that he conducted with the same ruthlessness he applied to anything that had defeated him. The mechanism had failed at the translation layer, not in the conceptual architecture, in the translation. The sorcerous mathematics had been sound. The interface between his dimension and the target dimension had buckled under a variance he had not accounted for, because the variance did not exist in his home dimension, and he had not known to model it. The warp. Here, the warp was not background. It was not a feature of certain powerful individuals or a resource accessed by specific disciplines of magic. It was the medium. Everything in this dimension was either shaped by it, adapted to it, armored against it, or drowned in it, and his apparatus, designed for dimensions where reality was substrate rather than participant, had encountered the warp's active interference and been shredded by it the way a ship's hull is shredded when it encounters a medium it was not built for. He rebuilt the model. He incorporated the warp as an active variable. He began designing the new apparatus. In the evenings, if the webway corridors of a craft world could be said to have evenings, Quillaveth found him. She had a habit of appearing without being detected, which under normal circumstances Doom would have catalogued as a security failure and corrected immediately. He chose not to correct it, because her appearances invariably contained information he wanted, delivered in a format that required patience to extract, but rewarded the patience consistently. She talked in the manner of someone who has been performing for long enough that they can no longer fully distinguish performance from speech, but the content beneath the performance was always precise. The other spirit seers debate you, she said one evening, settling into a position that should not have been comfortable against a seamless wraithbone wall, but which she inhabited with the relaxed confidence of someone who has decided a thing will be comfortable and made it so through conviction. Thesivale believes you are a sign. Of what sign, she has not decided. The young one, Eravale, believes you are a danger. He is correct, said Doom, not looking up from his work. And the third, old Calithris, who has not spoken to anyone but the dead for 2 centuries, came out of his chamber of whispers this morning for the first time since before the last Tyrannid engagement, and stood outside your door for 20 minutes. Doom looked up. Calathras has not left his chamber, said Quillaveth, since his son's spirit stone shattered in the Battle of Duriel's Passage. The son was 700 years old. Calathras has not spoken to the living since. Why is he outside my door? That, said Quillaveth, is what I am interested in knowing. She held up the hand mirror, not aimed at anything, just held it, the way a navigator holds a compass when they are checking their heading, reflexively, as a continuous operation. What do you see in that? Doom asked. Threads, she said. The shape of events before events are willing to admit what they are. Theater needs staging. If you know where to look, you can see the stage before the actors arrive. Divination. Dramaturgy. She lowered the mirror. The distinction matters. It does not. To you, perhaps, you see the future as a problem to be solved. We see it as a performance to be navigated. The difference is that your method produces solutions that work once. Ours produces ones that work in every version of the scene simultaneously. She paused. Usually. Doom returned to his work. After a moment he said, without looking up, the sorcerous geometry of this space has qualities I have not encountered before. The Wraithbone acts as a matrix for psychic resonance in a way that is structurally analogous to certain Latverian applications but significantly more efficient. We have had longer to refine it. You have had longer to stagnate, he said, without heat. Refinement implies continued development. What you have is a finished architecture that you maintain and mourn and do not surpass. The silence that followed was not offended. It was the silence of someone considering whether a criticism they disagree with is, nevertheless, accurate. Perhaps, she said finally. The Infinity Circuit, he said. You're dead. What are their experiences in there? They experience the craft world. They dream. They remember. They speak to those who know how to listen. And the warrior forms, the Wraith Guard, they are the dead, made to walk again. They are the dead, given purpose. The purpose is chosen. No spirit is placed in a warrior form without consent, in principle. In principle. The wars have been long, she said, and that was the end of that. He thought about his mother. He thought about her the way he always thought about her, not with sentimentality, not with the visible display of loss that he considered an obscenity of the private, but with the exact coordinates of her location held in the front of his mind at all times, the way a general holds a map. She was in Mephisto's hell. She had been there since his childhood. The machinery of her liberation was the deepest project of his life, the project that predated Latveria and the armor and the degree of mastery that made men who had not met him afraid of his name. Doom was the person he had made himself into in the service of that project. The armor was the project's instrument. Everything else, the kingdom, the power, the war against Richards, was infrastructure in service of the infrastructure. He had never found, in any place he had been, anything quite like what the Eldari had built, a means by which the dead do not depart but remain, not imprisoned, preserved, continued. He did not say this to Thessivale. But he thought about it, at length, in the silence of his working space, with the wraithbone walls radiating the residue of 10,000 years of grief. And he thought that if such a thing could be built, if such a thing could be engineered, a space in which his mother need not be where she was, a space he controlled and could protect and could maintain for as long as he drew breath, which would be a very, very long time, then perhaps the terms of his 30-year project could be reconsidered. Not abandoned, never abandoned, reconsidered. He slept poorly that night and blamed it on the webway's psychic pressure. The warning came on the 23rd day, not from the council and not from the spirit seers, but from Quillaveth, who appeared in his working space in the early hours when the Craftworld systems were in their minimal cycle, and stood in the center of the room without her usual oblique approach, standing straight, her fractured mirror held still at her side, and said, "Serevhas Null is coming." Doom noted the name, meaning. Drukari, Archon of the Shattered Cord Cabal. He has been conducting a sustained and patient operation against this craft world for 11 years. intercepting webway shipments, taking spirit stones and ghost helm units from supply transits before they reach Iron Den, selling the contents. She paused. He received word 3 days ago from an informant he has cultivated in this craft world service personnel that something unusual arrived through the webway, something without established allegiance, something in possession of sorcerous capacity that exceeds any Mon-Ki on record. He wants me. He wants what you know and what you carry. The Drukhari collect. They collect power, knowledge, suffering, novelty. A sorcerer king from outside this dimension entirely is all four simultaneously. She looked at the iron mask steadily. He is staging from a raiding base 3 webway junctions from here. He will breach in 7 hours. He has 42 Kabbalite warriors, 2 venoms, a raider transport, and his court. His court, an Archon's court, his incubi bodyguard. His Lamaean, who has killed 6 spirit seers on prior engagements. His Slith mercenaries, 3 of them, and a homunculus named Pale Oblation, who has been rebuilding failed spirit stone experiments into something that does not bear close examination. Doom set down the component he had been working on and turned fully to face her. 7 hours is sufficient time for me to complete the gate mechanism, he said. Quillaveth said nothing. My gate will be functional before the raid arrives, he continued. I have no obligation to this craft world, no alliance, no treaty, no debt. The Drukhari raid is not my concern. Quillaveth still said nothing. You knew this was coming, he said. You have known for more than 3 days. Given the nature of what you described as your discipline, the dramaturgy, you have known longer. You allowed it to approach. You are allowing it to reach its conclusion. I am curious, she said, what the conclusion will be. I have told you the conclusion. His voice was flat iron. I will be through the gate before the first breach. Yes, she said, you might be. She left. He worked. The gate mechanism was 3/4 complete when he stopped working. He stood in the center of his working space with his tools arranged on the floor around him, and he was completely still for a span of 4 minutes, which was, for Victor von Doom, an eternity of indecision, a thing so foreign to his internal landscape that it registered as a kind of illness, not fear, not hesitation in the coward's sense, something that had no clean name. The wraithbone walls breathed their amber light around him, and the residue of 10,000 years of accumulated dead pressed gently at his sorcerous perception, and from somewhere distant in the craft world's corridors, he heard something he had been hearing for weeks without consciously logging it, a tone that was not sound exactly, a harmonic generated by the infinity circuit's active elements as the spirits inside moved through their dreaming and their service. The dead, dreaming. He had come to a place where the dead were not abandoned, where something had been built specifically and deliberately and at incomprehensible cost to refuse the premise that death was the end of those worth keeping, where the will to preserve what you loved had been translated into engineering of the most sophisticated kind his sorceress training had ever encountered. He knew what Thessivale had meant, standing in the council chamber. The fortress is interesting. He had built himself into a fortress because the alternative was grief. And here was a civilization that had made the same choice on a civilizational scale and had held that choice against 10,000 years of attrition and horror and had not relented and was still here, still grieving and still fighting and still preserving their dead and carrying them forward, the dead outnumbering the living and the living refusing to apologize for the dead they carried. He recognized it. He recognized it in the particular way that you recognize something from inside, the way you recognize an argument that you have made yourself, seen in someone else's architecture. He picked up his tools and returned to work, but he worked differently now, reorganizing the output, building for a different purpose, and when Calithris appeared in his doorway, silent, as he had been reportedly silent for 2 centuries, Doom did not stop working, but he said, without turning, "How many of your dead can fight?" The old spirit seer was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice that had not been used in 2 centuries and carried that disuse like a scar, he said, Enough. Then bring them. The breach came in 6 hours and 40 minutes, not 7. Serevhas Null was not a man given to patience when he had already decided to move, and the information his informant had provided was sufficient that he saw no tactical value in the full 7 hours. He hit 3 points simultaneously, 2 through webway junctions his cabal had been using for 11 years to stage ambushes against Eondan's supply lines, and 1 through a fresh breach cut by the homunculus pale oblation, using methods that left the wraithbone of the breach edge scorched black and weeping something that was not quite blood. The first Kabbalite warriors through each breach moved in the low crouching run of professionals, dark light disintegrators already charged, their splinter rifles sweeping the spaces they entered with the compressed efficiency of soldiers who have done this many times. What they found waiting in the primary webway junction was not what they expected. Doom stood at the junction's center point, his cloak restored, his armor active, the gauntlets of his right hand charged with the particular deep emerald that his power wore when it was being held very carefully, the way a man holds a torch in a room full of dry timber. The gate mechanism was complete behind him. It was open. The transit back to his own dimension was available. The portal's light was pale green and entirely steady, waiting. He had not stepped through it. Beside him, to his left, Thessivale stood in her full working robes, her spirit seer staff active, its bone-white surface running with cold blue light. Behind her, 2 rows of Wraithguard, 7 in total, the spirits inside their warrior forms, carrying the peculiar stillness of those who have nothing left to be afraid of. And at Doom's right side, in the space 3 paces behind his shoulder where she had decided unilaterally to position herself, Quillaveth Morn, her motley shifting between colors that had no names, her mirror tucked away. Their sergeant, a woman with flesh so pale it was architectural, made a rapid hand signal to the warriors behind her that translated roughly as, recalculate. Serevhas Null came through 30 seconds later. He was everything his arcanate implied. Tall in the Drukhari manner, long-limbed and sharply articulated, his armor the color of deep water with accents of gold so fine they looked like wiring rather than ornamentation. His incubi flanked him, 4 of them, claves at rest, but rest being a courtesy term for weapons held in the particular stance that precedes use. His Lamaean was a step behind him, and what she held in her hands was not immediately identifiable, but introduced a scent into the air that Doom's armor systems tagged as psychoactive compound, airborne dispersal variant, which he filed as information and did nothing with yet. The foreign sorcerer, said Serevus, and his voice was what voices were when they were accustomed to absolute compliance. I had expected something larger. A common error, said Doom. The Archon's eyes moved around the junction with the comprehensive attention of a commander reading a tactical situation. The Wraithguard, the Spirit Seer, the portal, then back to Doom. The math being performed was rapid and visible, not because Serevhas was careless, but because he was confident, which was different. You can leave, said the Archon. Your door is open. The Craftworld's business with my cabal is older than your presence here, and significantly less interesting. Step through your gate, and I will allow it. You will allow it, Doom repeated. I will. You are speaking to Victor von Doom, said Doom, and you are speaking to him in his presence about what he will be allowed. He said it without heat. He said it with the absolute categorical flatness of something that is not an argument, but a correction of record. I will say it once more, said Doom. You will withdraw. You will return what you have taken from this Craftworld's transits, in whatever condition you have it, understanding that I will not pretend the condition will be acceptable, and you will not return. This is not a negotiation. I have stated the resolution. Your participation consists of accepting it. Serevhas Null looked at him for a long, studied moment. Then he smiled with the particular smile of a being who has accumulated 10,000 years of cruelty and finds novelty in it only rarely. Kill him, he said. The claves moved. Doom's right hand rose. What came from it was not the sorcerous bolt of a practiced exchange, not the opening gambit of a duel. It was the full, concentrated expression of Victor von Doom's sorcerous will, drawn through the matrix of the Wraithbone junction which he had spent 3 weeks learning to read, and which he now used as a conducting medium with the ease of long familiarity, and it struck the nearest incubi at the center mass, with enough force to displace him from his feet and carry him through the Wraithbone wall at the junction's far end. Not a hole, a tunnel, the wall sealed behind him in the manner of material that has been not broken but pushed. The second incubi was faster. His cliver connected with Doom's armor along the shoulder he had already repaired, and the ionic resonance of the cliver's dissonant field ran through his systems in a cascade that tasted of copper and static, his armor registering the hit with all the alarm it registered any hit, which was the same as none. Doom's left hand caught the incubi's wrist. His grip was steel on a scale that had nothing to do with the flesh inside the armor, a grip backed by the exoskeletal amplification of his suit and the particular intention of a man who does not take half measures. He turned, he threw the incubi at the third. They met the Wraithbone floor as one. The Lamaean moved. She moved the way trained assassins move in the moment of maximum opportunity, which was the moment when the primary target's attention was distributed, and what she released from her hands was a compound that Doom's systems tagged in the same instant his sorcerous perception tagged it. Psychoactive and warp resonant both, designed to work simultaneously on the physical and psychic levels, a compound designed to breach psychic defenses by using the body as a delivery mechanism before the mind could respond. It met the outer edge of Doom's sorcerous field and dissipated. Not blocked. Dissipated, converted into base components by the active sorcerous barrier that he maintained as a continuous background operation, the same barrier that served as his first defense against Mephisto's influence, against Richard's toys, against anything that attempted to reach past the iron of him by going around it. She had nothing left in her hands. He looked at her, she looked at him. He dismissed her with the quality of attention that is itself an insult, and returned his regard to Serevhas. The Archon had not moved. He was watching with the calculating stillness of someone updating a model in real time, and what the model was telling him was audible in the set of his shoulders, the particular tension at the jaw that precedes either attack or retreat. The Kabbalite warriors had spread into the junction, 42 of them, disintegrators up, splinter rifles active. They had the junction encircled in the tactical formation of a unit that has been told their subject is to be taken alive, which made things geometrically more complicated because it meant they were not trying to kill him, which meant they could afford to fire at will, since anything short of direct disintegration could be adjusted for. They fired. Doom moved through it. Not around it, not through cover, but through it. The sorcerous field around him converting the disintegrator blasts at their outer edge, absorbing the splinter rounds into a kinetic sink that he maintained in the same automatic register as breathing, and he moved through the fire the way he moved through everything, with the absolute certainty of a man who knows what he is capable of and has decided that certainty is more useful than caution. He reached the left flank of the circle in 4 strides. His hands moved. Not the careful, contained version of his power, not the surgical deployment he used for targets he needed to leave intact. The full expression, the doom of it. A sorcerous pulse that expanded outward from him in a wave that moved through the junction with the quality of something that was not merely energy but opinion, the opinion of a will so total it had become physics, and it hit the left flank of the Kabbalite line and removed it from engagement in the most thorough sense. 8 warriors lifted and carried to the junction wall with a force that left the wall permanently indented. The Wraithguard committed. 7 of them, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of beings that do not experience urgency because urgency is a function of fearing time running out, and what the dead have in abundance is time. Their ghostfire projectors sang, a tone that was technically sound but felt like history being spoken aloud, and the Kabbalite warriors that the Wraithfire reached were examined by it and found to be temporary in ways they had not previously considered. Thesivael's staff wove through the space above the battlefield in arcs that left traceries of blue light that resolved into sorcerous anchors, points of fixed reality in the junction, that disrupted the dark light disintegrators targeting matrices by a margin just sufficient to scatter their fire from its intended trajectories. Doom took a disintegrator round to the center of his chest plate. It did not disintegrate him. The sorcerous field held, but the field was paying a price for holding, the price being measured in the reserves he was drawing on, which were not the limitless resource they were at full capacity, which they were not yet, not 3 weeks after the apparatus had drained him. He felt the deduction, he noted it, he did not show it. Pale oblation arrived through the fresh breach, moving in the manner of homunculi, which was the manner of beings who have spent so long in voluntary proximity to pain that they have developed a aesthetic relationship with it, his augmented form tall and asymmetrical, carrying in his modified hands devices that Doom catalogued in the same moment he recognized their purpose and felt something that was not quite revulsion but was adjacent to it. Spirit stone extraction tools modified for active combat use, designed to take the soul stones from living Eldari by force, a process that the Eldari standing in this junction would have a very precise vocabulary for, and he did not need to know that vocabulary to understand what it meant. He turned toward Pale Oblation. "No," said Doom. He said it the way he said most things, as a declaration of law, not a response to a situation. Then he hit the homunculus with everything he had decided the situation had earned. The sorcerous blast moved through the junction like a thing that had decided the distance between them was an insult and corrected it. It was emerald fire wrapped around something older, something that traced its lineage back through the Doctor Strange tutorials in disciplined sorcery, back through Doom's own decades of practice, back through the occult tradition he had absorbed and exceeded and made his own. And what it did to Pale Oblation was comprehensively thorough. Not death, not in the way death usually means. Doom had no interest in what happened to the homunculus's body. What he did was reach into the modified devices and destroy their interface mechanisms with surgical precision, rendering them inert, and then he turned back to Cerevus Null. Cerevus Null, who had, in the past 4 minutes, watched his incubi bodyguard be removed from the engagement with no casualties on the other side, watched his Kabbalite flanks shredded by the combination of a single armored sorcerer and 7 Wraithguard, watched his Lamaean's payload fail, watched his homunculus's tools become decorative. "The resolution I described," said Doom, "remains available." Cerevus looked at him. His face was the face of someone performing the mathematics of revenge, calculating not whether to take it, but how long the calculation required, and what variables would change the optimal moment. "This," said the Archon, "is not finished." "Nothing ever is," said Doom. "Withdraw." For a moment, the junction held its breath. Then Cerevus Null turned and walked back through the breach, and his remaining warriors followed him, and the breach sealed behind them with the sound of something very old and very patient waiting. The silence that filled the junction afterward was the silence of aftermath, which is different from other silences. It carries the specific weight of what was almost worse. Thesivale stood among her Wraithguard, and she was looking at the portal, still open, still steady, still waiting. She said nothing. Quillaveth appeared from wherever she had been during the fight, which Doom was certain was not the position he had last seen her in. She held her mirror in one hand, and she was looking at it with the expression of someone reading the last page of a text they have been interpreting for a long time, and the expression was not satisfaction. It was something more complex than satisfaction. It was the expression of someone who has seen what the last act is and is not yet certain how they feel about it. Doom walked to the portal. He stood in front of it. The light from his own dimension was pale green and cool, and carried in it the smell of things he knew, Latverian winter, the particular electromagnetic signature of his own armory, the resonance of a kingdom maintained by his will and waiting for his return. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned. "The webway junctions he used," he said. "Tell me which ones he has used for 11 years. Thesivale looked at him with an expression that was not surprise, because she had not allowed herself to be surprised, but which contained something that surprise would have looked like if it had permission to exist. The spirit seers will need to reconsecrate them, she said carefully. Yes, and while they do, I will help you identify the others. There are 17 Drukhari staging points within viable raiding distance of your webway access system. I catalogued them during the 3 weeks I spent learning to read your sorceress geometry. Some of them your council knows about, some they do not. Calithras, who had not spoken to the living in 2 centuries before tonight, spoke again. His voice was still a scar, but it was a scar being used. Why? He said. Not accusation, genuine inquiry. Doom looked at the old spirit seer for a long moment. Then he looked at the walls of the junction, at the wraithbone pulsing with the light of the dead who lived in it, at the wraithguards standing in their patient immortal readiness, at the craft world that had been dying for 10,000 years and had refused to finish dying. Because I understand the project, he said. He did not say more than that. He did not need to. He closed the portal with his left hand and turned back to the junction, and he began to walk toward the breach pale oblation had cut, the one that was still weeping from its edges, because the 3 closest staging points were in that direction, and it was more efficient to address them sequentially than to double back. Quillaveth fell into step behind him. He said, without turning, "You knew." "I knew a version," she said. "Which one?" "The one where you stand in front of your open door for 30 seconds and walk away from it. I have seen it many times, in the mirror." She paused. "I did not know whether it would be this version specifically. I knew it would be one of the versions where you don't leave." "There are versions where I leave." "Many," she said. "You leave in most of them, actually. You are a man with a kingdom. You have a great deal to return to." "I do. And yet," he agreed. They walked. The first staging point was 6 webway junctions distant, and Doom dismantled it in 22 minutes, primarily through the application of his sorceress architecture skills to its inverse, which was to say that what he had spent 3 weeks learning to build, he now spent 22 minutes learning to destroy specifically, taking apart the sorceress geometry that gave the staging point its concealment and stability in a way that could not be rebuilt without knowing what had made it work, and which therefore rendered the location useless to Serevhas Null's 11-year operation against Ianden's supply lines. He moved to the second. Over the following 6 days, working outward from Ianden through the webway's branching corridors, in company with the 3 spirit seers and, periodically, Quillaveth, he dismantled 9 of the 17 staging points. The other 8 were in positions that would require longer-range webway transit to reach, and he spent 2 days with Thessavale's navigational knowledge and his own sorceress mapping, building a route that would reach all 8 in sequence while maintaining Ianden's webway access integrity, because some of the staging points were nested in junctions that were also load-bearing elements of the craft world's webway access structure, and removing them improperly would damage access routes that the craft world needed. The precision required for this was considerable, and he gave it considerable attention. Calithras, on the 3rd day, spoke to him again, this time at length. The old spirit seer's voice remained scarred, but was developing a quality of being used, the way a muscle develops with use, a returning capacity that seemed to surprise him by its own existence. He spoke about his son, about the Battle of Duriel's Passage, about what it meant that his son's spirit stone had shattered, which was not just death, not the death the Mon-Ki knew, but something specifically catastrophic to the Eldari, the true end, the permanent end, the end beyond which even Ianden's extraordinary refusal of finality could not reach. Doom listened, not with the performance of listening that he maintained in diplomatic contexts, but with the real thing. On the 4th day, he said to Calithras, "Tell me about the structure of the spirit stone itself, the sorceress architecture of it, not the cultural context, the mechanism." Calithras told him. On the 5th day, Doom said nothing, but in the evening he worked on something that was not the gate mechanism, something smaller, something that would have taken a sorcerer of lesser capacity much longer to conceptualize, and when it was done, he held it in his gauntleted hand and looked at it, and then looked at the wraithbone wall, and then put it in a pocket and did not speak about it. On the 6th day, Thesivael found him in his working space and sat down across from him with the directness of someone who has decided that indirection has served its purpose. "You are staying," she said. "I am completing the project I have begun," he said. "It is not the same thing." Semantics. Precision. She studied him. "What do you want from us? In exchange for what you have done, what you are doing, there is always an exchange." "Knowledge," he said. "The infinity circuit, its architecture, the principles of its construction, not to use against you, not to replicate it, to understand it, for my own purposes." Thesivael was quiet for a long time. Around them, the Wraithbone breathed. "My purposes," Doom continued, "are the same purposes they have always been. One soul, not a craft world, not a civilization. One soul, in a place where it should not be, kept there by a power that has interests in keeping it. I have been working toward her liberation for 30 years. I will work toward it for 30 more, or 300 more, if that is what is required. I am asking whether Ayanden has knowledge that is relevant to that work." "You are asking," she said slowly, "whether the infinity circuit has ever been used to hold a soul against a hostile dimension." "Yes." She looked at the walls, at the light in them, at 30,000 years of dead who lived there, dreaming and serving and refusing to leave. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it has." The next 3 days were different. They were the days of exchange, genuine exchange, the kind that happens when two architectures of knowledge recognize each other, and the recognition produces something neither could have developed independently. Thesivael brought the Ayanden records that bore on the subject, and they were ancient enough that Doom's Gothic could barely reach them without Quillaveth's translation, and what they contained was the history of the infinity circuit's use as a refuge and a fortress and a weapon against forces that tried to consume what was inside it. Doom brought his 3 decades of work toward his mother's liberation, stripped of the parts that had no application here, and laid the applicable architecture out on the floor of the working space in sorcerous geometry that the spirit seers could read, and Thesivael moved through it like a reader moving through a very long and very serious text, pausing at points to ask questions that demonstrated she understood what she was reading. It was not a solution, it was a direction. It was more than he had come away with in the last 3 years combined. He did not say this. He noted it in the interior space, where he kept things that were not for anyone else. On the last day, he rebuilt the gate mechanism. He built it differently than he had built it the first time, with the warp's active variants modeled in and compensated for, with the webway's psychic geometry used as a stabilizing medium rather than avoided as an interference, with modifications that reflected the 6 weeks of immersion in a sorcerous tradition that predated his by 30,000 years. The gate was substantially better than the first one would have been. He stood before it and it was open, and the pale green light of his own dimension fell on the Wraithbone floor, and on the iron of his armor, and on the scorched hem of his cloak that had never fully recovered from the first apparatus's failure. Thesivael was there, Calithris. Erevael, the young spirit seer who had never fully trusted him but who was standing here regardless, which said something about what the last 6 weeks had meant to him. Quillaveth was there. She held her mirror. Doom looked at the craft world around him, at the walls full of dead, at the Wraith Guard standing their patient vigil, at the 3 spirit seers who had opened their most guarded records to an armored Monkey who had walked in through a webway collapse and refused to scream. He put his hand into the pocket of his cloak and withdrew what he had made on the 5th night. He held it out toward Calithris. It was small. It was made from components he had synthesized from first principles using his own sorcerous reserves, and it was built to the architecture Calithris had described when he spoke about spirit stones, built to the mechanism, not to the crystal specifically, but to the function, built as a theoretical exercise in whether the mechanism could be replicated in a form that owed nothing to the Wraithbone matrix, that owed nothing to the Eldari sorceress tradition, that was pure doom in its construction, while being pure spirit stone in its purpose. It was imperfect. It would require refinement. It was a first attempt at a very difficult problem. Calithris took it, He held it for a long time. His face moved through expressions that had not been on it in 2 centuries. "It will not hold," he said. "Not yet. The resonance frequency is 2 degrees off the correct lattice." "I know," said Doom. "I lack the materials to correct it here. When I return to my laboratory, the correction is 12 hours' work." Calithris looked at the small thing in his hands. Then he looked at Doom. "Why?" he said again. Doom looked at him. At this old spirit seer, who had not spoken to the living in 2 centuries because his son's spirit stone had shattered in a battle for a craft world that had been dying since before Doom's species had learned to write. This man who had been sitting in a room with the dead for 200 years, not because he had given up, but because the living were very loud and the dead were very quiet, and in the quiet he could still hear something that sounded, faintly, like his son. "Because I understand the project," Doom said, "and because precision is its own kind of respect." He turned to the gate. He stopped. Without turning, he said to Quillaveth, "Your mirror, did it show you this specifically?" "No," she said, and her voice had in it the thing that had been there since the corridor, since the first laughter, since the fractured mirror had shown her the architecture of a man who had made himself a fortress and was standing inside a civilization that had done the same thing at civilizational scale. The thing that was not mockery and was not warmth but lived in the space between them where complex recognitions live. It showed me someone leaving, what they took with them and what they left behind. Those were the parts the mirror left for the story to decide. "Imprecise," he said. "Accurate," she said. He went through the gate. The pale green light closed behind him, and the junction was quiet, and the wraithbone walls breathed their amber pulse, and the dead dreamed in the infinity circuit, and Calithris stood with a small, imperfect sorceress thing in his hands, and said nothing, but said nothing, in the way of someone who has something to say, and is simply choosing when to say it. Thesivael stood at the place where the gate had been, and looked at the smooth, unbroken wraithbone surface, and at the floor beneath it, where the sorcerous geometry of Doom's transit had left marks in the material. Not damage, marks, the way feet leave marks in sand, impressions of something that had been there and moved through. She read them for a long time. Then she said, "To no one in particular, and to everyone present, he will come back." Erevael, the young spirit seer, the one who had never trusted, said, "How do you know?" Thesivael looked at the marks on the floor, at the mathematics of a man who had rebuilt a gate in the webway with one eye on the exit and one eye on the work that still needed doing, at the design of someone who made things to last, who built infrastructure for projects that outlasted seasons and years and decades, who had chosen, at least once and against his own stated position, to stay. "Because he has not finished," she said. In the corridors of the webway, the ancient passages that ran beneath and between and through the bones of a dying civilization that refused to finish dying, the residue of his transit still sang in the sorcerous tracery of the walls, a frequency that the Wraithguard did not recognize and the spirit seers could not fully read, but that Quillaveth Morn, standing with her mirror finally still at her side, understood as the signature of a will so total it had calcified into architecture, the echo of a fortress that had passed through a place full of other fortresses, and been changed by the passage in ways that would not be visible until the change had finished settling. She put her mirror away. She had already seen the next act. She did not tell them what it was. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, a man in iron had walked through 10,000 years of grief and had not flinched, had not screamed, had not relented, had turned from an open door and chosen, for reasons he would never fully articulate to anyone, and that did not require articulation, to fight for people he did not need to fight for, and had left behind him the first exchange between his sorcery and theirs, the first bridge built between a dying species' most sacred architecture and the cold, determined genius of a man who had been trying to bring his mother home for 30 years, and the bridge was imperfect and needed refinement, and was, by any rigorous assessment of its current state, incomplete. But Victor von Doom had never yet left a project incomplete. And the Eldari of Iandan, who had learned to read the shape of stubborn things across 10,000 years of outlasting them, felt something shift in the infinity circuit's dreaming, felt the dead turn in their long sleep towards something new, something that smelled of different stars and older grief and the particular iron certainty of a man who knows exactly what he is building and is not finished building it. The fortress had visited the fortress, and both, in their separate silences, in their armored solitudes, across the void of dimensions that would not stay permanently divided from one another,